All right. Oh, here we go. Somebody. All right. Well, welcome to what is this now? Week 5. Believe it or not, that means we're getting kind of around the 1/3 of the way through the course already. Hardly seems possible. Feels like we just got started. So for tonight, there basically are two main topics or two main subjects for this evening. One of them, broadly speaking, is the concept of segmenting or segmentation of a lesson plan. So we're going to take a look at a particular strategy, sort of a 4-step process that will allow you to take a look at an instructional goal and then develop a concrete set of steps that will lead your students to that goal of sort of points along the way. So we're going to look at that, and then sort of tied to that, or sort of a sub idea off of that, is to talk a little bit about prerequisites, pre-training, as a part of that developing of the steps. So once you kind of know what your steps are going to be, we're also going to then take a look at some ways to think about what are the prerequisites that a student has to have in place already for them to be successful on this particular step of a process, or of a learning experience. So those are going to be our two main things for tonight. We're going to look at that 4-step process, and as a class, kind of walk through a scenario, so we can see how it applies in a specific situation, um, and then talk a little bit about the pre-training and prerequisite piece of it. And yeah, and then I should be able to get you all on your way relatively. I don't know if early is the right word, because it is a Tuesday night and it already feels like it's late, but at least in a timely manner for this evening, and then going on for the week. Just a couple things though before we get into all of that. Number one, I managed to get caught up on a good deal of what's been turned in, which at this point has been mostly forum posts and so on. So I have been trying to go through all of that in Blackboard. So you should start to see basically some sort of grade information show up there. I know this tonight was sort of technically when phase 1 was due, although I know a number of people need some extra time on that, and that's totally fine. I'm going to hope to start to get to the phase 1s that have been turned in over the course of the next several days. However, I am going to be traveling from Thursday through Sunday of this week. So some of my time is going to be somewhat limited. So I do promise I'm going to try to stay on top of it and try to get through everything. But I may not have as much time this week as I would like. The school where I did my undergraduate work, which was the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, is celebrating its 100th anniversary this coming weekend. So I'm traveling to Rochester to go see my alma mater and meet up with some friends from there and help them celebrate 100 years. So but I will still be accessible by email. I will still be checking in on emails and so on. So still don't hesitate to reach out to me over that time. All right. So beyond that, before we move into new material, because in a way tonight kind of begins the next, if you want to think of it this way, sort of the next unit of the class. So far, we've been focused on analyzing and goal setting. And tonight we kind of start to head into a new direction and start to actually build our instructional design blueprints. So before we take that step forward, any comments, concerns, questions, maybe related to the phase 1, to anything that we've been working on so far, anything that I can help to address to begin with here before we head off into new territory. All right. Well, silence is deafening. Yeah, if anything comes up, just chime in. I'm here to help out, but as I go through those phase one documents, hopefully that'll also give me a good chance to kind of check in and make sure that sort of everything is progressing as it should be. All right, so let me, as I like to do here, switch over so that we're not looking at this, that we're looking at this instead. Doot, doot, doot. And move some things around here on my screen so that I can see everybody. All right, so for week 5, as I said, the two main things are segmenting and prerequisite planning. Together, those two things fall under what we would call informational processing analysis. And that's just a fancy way of saying building a roadmap, that we're going to be taking a goal and we're going to be starting to break that goal down into discrete steps to figure out how we're going to move our students from point A to point B. You will probably hear me lean pretty heavily into using an analogy of taking a trip, because in many ways that mirrors exactly what we're going to be doing in terms of these steps with the instructional design. So to kind of set the stage of that analogy, what we did up until now was sort of learn a little bit about the territory that we're going to be traveling through. We've learned a little bit about the vehicle that we are going to be taking to get on our journey. And at the end, we set our goal, which is basically where we are trying to head to. So for instance, in a few days, I'm heading to Rochester. So that is my goal. I know why I'm heading towards that goal. I know why it's important. I know how it fits into, sort of everything else that's going on. So that's where we've gotten to. So now the information processing analysis is, okay, I'm leaving here and I need to get to Rochester. So what are the steps that I have to do in between? And at the risk of stretching the analogy too far, I could go onto a GPS and have it tell me how to get there. And most likely that GPS is going to give me 3 or 4 different routes. And what I'm going to need to do is figure out which of those routes makes the most sense. Why are there things that I'm concerned about that the route's not taking into account, and so on. So that's what we're going to be looking at. There's basically the work for this week, and I'll go over this in more detail towards the end. There is a reading. There's a chapter reading that is specifically about sequencing and pre-training, just to get a little bit of an additional perspective on those concepts. So I would recommend probably reading that relatively early in the week, because that will help to reinforce and to add on to some of the things that we're going to be talking about this evening. And then really the only other work for the week is to take, if you've got multiple instructional goals as part of your ID plan, take one of those goals and you're going to basically create an outline of the steps that you think are going to be necessary in order to get your students to the goal at the end. You'll be posting those steps, that outline, in a forum so that others can kind of give you some feedback on it. I know we have several people in the class who are working on similar goals, similar subject areas. So it would be helpful to have somebody else who maybe is working with your same topic or a similar topic be able to look at what you're doing as just kind of a fresh set of eyes and give some feedback on it. So those two things are really it in terms of work this week, is a reading and then developing your plan, your segmented plan for one of your instructional goals. If you only have one in your plan, then that's obviously the one you're going to use. For this week's work, if you have multiple instructional goals you're aiming for, you'll just pick one of them for this week just to get started. And then I think once you have a sense of how it works, you'll be able to then apply that to the others. So let's jump then over to here. And let me get into where I can actually edit this page. Boop, 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 boop. All right. So information processing analysis, or IPA. I don't know if we have beer drinkers around, but IPA always rings a bell for me. Not that I'm a drinker of IPAs, but I have family members that love IPAs. So every time I say IPA, that's the first thing that pops into my mind. In any case, so the 4 steps that we're going to look at, I've got kind of laid out here. I'll try to make that a little bigger. And this isn't the only way to figure out how to segment something, but I think it's a pretty good way. And if you follow each step carefully, it should get you to a point where what you've got laid out is a pretty good roadmap for getting your students from point A to point B. So we're always going to start with the goal. And in a minute, as a class, we're going to come up with a goal just so we have something practical that we can kind of work through this on. Then the first step is sort of gathering any information about the task or the content. So how does someone know when they are supposed to do this thing that you're trying to get them to do? If there's any vocabulary terms or any things that they need to know ahead of time that are important so that they can make their way through this roadmap. A good way to deal with this is to create a test question. What would you ask on an assessment to find out whether the students know this thing? And that gives you a good kind of touchstone to focus on. You've got your goal, but then that also kind of puts it in a concrete perspective of, well, how do I get the students to a point where they can answer this question correctly or do this thing correctly on an assessment? So this is kind of like we did with the instructional design as a whole, kind of a mini analysis phase. Then next one is use the experts. And obviously in many cases, especially if you're doing this for your own classroom, you may very well be the expert that you're drawing from. But in some cases, you may be trying to cover a skill or a subject area that you're not as familiar with. In which case, if you can find somebody who is an expert in that field or an expert at doing whatever the thing is you're trying to teach, trying to get connected with them can be a really useful thing, because what you want to do is actually watch the person complete the task that you're trying to get your students to complete. And yeah, that could mean videotaping them or just watching and taking notes. What did they do? Ask them to clarify why they did something. Why did they make a particular decision to do something a certain way? What was their thought process? So again, if that's you, then sit down and do the thing you're asking the students to do, but kind of as you're doing it, take notes about what steps you're doing and why are you making the decisions you're making. If you find that there's multiple ways, or you've watched different experts go through this thing and they do it different ways, see if you can kind of find the middle ground between them. See if there's common things that that all of the experts do when they're trying to solve this problem or address this situation. So once you've watched somebody do this, whether that's you or someone else, and you kind of have a good understanding of how the expert does it, then you then can start laying out what the path is that you want your students to follow. There may be more than one path. Again, if I plug in a route to Rochester, I'm going to get 3 or 4 options that at least my GPS thinks are viable. So you then, if you've got multiple possible routes for your students to go, think about, first of all, sort of what the easiest of those paths is. So if I'm driving, that might mean for me what the shortest drive time is. If I'm driving all the way across the state of New York, I want it to take as little time as possible so I can get where I'm going. But you also may need to, depending on the skill or whatever you're working on, there may be times where a more complex path is needed for particular reasons. And if that might be the case, you want to identify why that might be. again, I apologize for stretching the analogy, but maybe I don't have a easy pass, or I don't like to pay tolls. So I might have to take a different route to Rochester that may be longer. It may not be the shortest route or the easiest route, but if I have a restriction where I can't pay tolls, or maybe I'm driving a big truck and I can't drive on parkways or something like that, there may be other circumstances that mean that you have to use a path that maybe not be the shortest one. So that would be something good to identify early on. Maybe you're wanting your students to go through particular steps that may not strictly be necessary, but you want them to have the experience of going through those steps. That might make you want to use a slightly longer path to get there. And then once you've kind of analyzed all of those paths and figured out which ones work best where, then you want to pick the one that's actually going to be the foundation of your teaching. So what's the one? Take a look at your goal again, look at these different paths and try to figure out which of those is the one that's going to best align with your goals. And then the final of these steps is to make the steps. Now you know what the direction that you're going to go. So now you actually sort of document what each of those steps is. So you want to write them out in sequential order. Do this first, read this second, go over this third, practice this fourth. Try to make the steps roughly equal in terms of effort. You don't want to have something where one step just asks them to answer a single true false question, and then the next step requires them to write a 10-page essay. You want these steps to be roughly the same in size. So if you find yourself with a really large step, you might need to break it up into smaller steps. Or if you find yourself with a couple of really tiny steps, maybe those can be combined into a larger step. And, in terms of number of steps, I know this is a pretty wide range, 3 to 12. But if you're dealing with a single learning goal, a single SMART goal, it should be somewhere in that range and probably kind of in the middle of that range. If it's fewer than 3 steps, then it's probably not much of a goal. What you really have then as a goal is just a thing that they need to do, a single activity. If you find yourself getting into 15 and 20 steps, then it probably means that either your goal is too broad, or that you're just being too detailed with your goals or with your steps, and you might want to kind of combine some of them together into slightly larger steps. These steps is about the outcomes of each step, not about what you're going to do to teach it, if that makes sense. So a step wouldn't be, the students are going to read this book or read this chapter. It would be more like the students will develop an understanding of this thing. The way they'll do that is by reading a chapter or looking at a handout or reading a website or something like that. But the steps, you want to focus on what the student will be able to do at the end of each step. So at the end of this step, they will be able to do this. And then at the end of this step, they'll be able to do this. We will be getting into, in the next couple of phases, then the strategies for what they're actually going to do and what materials you need for each step. But try to stay as much as possible to stay focused on the outcomes. I know that can be hard. Sometimes steps just really want to be a thing that they do as opposed to what they will get out of it. But as much as possible, try to focus on the outcomes. And then it's always good, as a little bit of a evaluation. Once you have the steps written out, if you're the expert, then try taking the steps and following them exactly the way you have them written and see if they are enough, if they work. If you're not the expert you're drawing from, then take what you've written to an expert and say, hey, can you look this over, see if this makes sense, see if I missed anything. And if they have suggestions for some different things, then that gives you a chance to build those in before you get too far down the road. So that's sort of this is the framework that I would like you all to use in terms of going through this segmenting process, coming up with the steps. So do a little analysis of the task. What vocabulary do they need to know? When will they need to use this? Make those test questions. Then analyze what the experts do. And then once you've watched that, then figure out what your path is going to be out of what you saw the experts do. And then once you have that path, figure out what the steps are in that path. Go 25 miles, turn right on this highway, go 35 miles, turn left here. Those are your steps. Um, so, all right. So before we get into kind of doing a practical application of this, any questions or comments so far on that framework? Does that more or less make sense? I see some nodding heads. That's always a comforting sign. I like seeing nodding heads. All right, so yeah, let's try this and kind of see what we come up with in terms of what each of these would look like. I mean, we're not going to obviously write up a whole document here, but try to at least kind of walk through with a concrete example. So, what would be what's a SMART goal we can use? I think last year's class, the goal that they used was something like they will be able to determine the area of a circle or something. It had something to do with geometry and areas of circles and things like that. So, who wants to throw out let's keep it pretty straightforward, nothing too philosophical, but what might be a good SMART goal? By the end of the week, our students will be able to what? Somebody throws something out here. I could always put something musical in, but I don't know that anybody's going to care about that. Or we could go with the circle. Do we have any math teachers here? I can't remember what everybody here teaches. Nothing. All right. Well, let's just go with the circle one then. So let's say they will be able to calculate the area of a circle. I think it was something along those lines. So pretty cut and dried. It's a pretty specific goal. It's measurable because they will get the right answer or not based off of the information that they're given. We're going to assume that this is probably for a math class, a geometry class or something, so it would be applicable to the class. And it's results oriented because it's about the thing that they can do at the end. This is what they will be able to do. It's not about what they're going to have to do to get to the point where they can do this thing. So we'll go with that. This will be our SMART goal that we are now trying to build an instructional design for. So this first question here, how does someone know when to do that? So what we're looking for here is kind of what are the situations that someone would be in where they would have to calculate the area of a circle. I mean, I guess one would be because the teacher told me to. um, but obviously we want this stuff to probably apply to more real world situations. So what would be a couple of real world situations where somebody would actually have to calculate the area of a circle?
When you're trying to fill up a hole or something.
Okay, so maybe let's see. Why don't we say it's like in construction. Oh, I'm going off the edge of the screen there. Let me zoom out a little bit here. So construction, maybe you've got to calculate um, the amount of concrete or something that needs to go into to fill a hole. Okay. What else? What else might be a practical application of circles?
Okay, I got one.
All right.
Okay, what about an arc? So you need to draw a circle in a particular area.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay,
So maybe an art project. Maybe you're doing something and you need to cover a circle with material, and you need to know how much material you've got to buy in order to cover the circle. So, uh,
exactly. Yeah.
material choose choice. Right. So, and I mean, we could go on and on. There's probably reasons in certainly like drafting classes, certainly construction classes or materials classes. Um, I could even see in probably some science classes where you need to calculate the area of a circle, maybe to figure out how much liquid goes into a beaker or something. I mean, that gets into volume, but anyway, so you want to know what are the places where this is going to apply, because that's going to also help you with the finding of the experts. You want to put this in terms of like, well, who is it that does this thing and why do they do it and how do they do it when they need to do it, sort of an idea. So this will test again. I don't know if we have any math teachers here, but we'll test all of our how well we recall our geometry classes from whenever we last took a geometry class. But what are some of the key vocabulary that you need to know if you're calculating an area of a circle?
3.14 pi.
Yep, you've got pi is always there. 3.1415927 or something like that. Yep, we definitely need that. We're going to need that. What else might we need?
Well, the formula would be like pi r squared, so pi radius squared.
Okay, so radius is another one. Um, let's see. We could probably also put in diameter, because sometimes you don't have the radius of a circle. You're given the diameter of the circle, and then you've got to figure out the radius. Um, maybe let's see. Maybe circumference. Again, it depends on what information you're given. Maybe all you're given is the circumference, and then you've got to back calculate to figure out the rest of it. So let's see. I'm trying to think what else.
In the whole example, do you need depth or not?
Well, if I guess that would be if the volume of a cylinder. So I guess we'll limit ourselves to just a two-dimensional circle. But yeah, you're right. If we were doing the concrete thing, that's a hole, and there we're actually calculating volume. But so, all right, I think that's again sort of stretching back to my math knowledge. I'm pretty sure that's most of the vocabulary you would need. So you're giving an assessment, and uh, what you're trying to do is find out if your students can calculate the area of a circle. So what might a test question look like that would ask somebody to do that? I mean, I
You're
guess.
given two of the three things needed, and they have to figure out what the third is, I guess.
Okay, yeah. I mean, obviously, our goal is almost a test question in itself, but yeah, we could say like maybe something like given the following diagram, and that diagram would probably have a couple of things labeled on it. Calculate the area of the circle. All right. And then there would be a diagram attached that would maybe give the radius of it or the diameter of it or something like that. All right. So that kind of gives us our ending point. Like this is what we're going to ask them to do in the end. So now we've got to get them there. So what we'll do next is then look at the experts. So we would watch somebody do this. So, let's say that what was given was a circle drawing that had a diameter labeled across it, and the question was given the following diagram, calculate the area of the circle. So, um, one step that probably happens, and it already happened here, might be, one, remember the formula. So you kind of need to know which of all these math formulas that I've been taught do I need to remember to get the area of a circle? Is that pi r squared, or was it pi r cubed, or was that the 2r whatever? So that might be the first step. So you're watching somebody do this, and you hear them mutter under their breath, "Oh, pi r squared." Okay, all right. So there's our first step, and then second step. In this particular case, they're given diameter; they'd have to get to radius. So figure out radius from givens might be the next thing that they do. And then 3 would be probably what? So now we've got the radius, we know the formula. What's probably the next step?
Use it an example of some kind.
Yeah, or plug the numbers into the formula based on the example that we're given. So if, oops, not plus, plug in the numbers. So we've remembered the formula, and now we know the things that we need to plug into that formula, the r and the pi, and now we plug the numbers into that. And then number 4 would be to actually probably do the calculation in order to get the number. And then 5 would probably be something like write out complete answer. I know math teachers love this, with units, because it's going to have a certain kind of unit that it goes there. So I mean, obviously we're dealing with a pretty simplistic goal here, but again, if you're not a math expert, then you would literally maybe go find a math colleague and say, "Hey, can you walk me through what you do if this is what you're being asked to do?" Um, and you walk through, and as they're going through, you ask questions. Well, why did you do that, or where did you get that number from, or things like that, and just kind of take the notes on that. Um, this is probably simple enough that there are not going to be a lot of discrepancies between different people doing this question, but there might be. Who knows? So again, I'm not a math teacher, so I don't really know the specifics of whether there are other approaches. I know there's the whole new math thing that kind of has turned math on its head in terms of how you do stuff. So maybe that would affect this. I don't know, um, but kind of get yourself to a point where you really understand exactly how to do the thing.
Yeah, you might want to be able to show the work how you got the answer too.
Oh, sure. So plug in numbers. So calculation, we could put that there. Be sure to show work as they're doing the calculation. So if it's a multiple step, just show how you did each part of it, what order you did the things in. Um, because, for instance, pi r squared, even though it's a really simple equation, I do know this much, is that you have to do the exponent first, and then you would do the multiplication. So it's possible that a student might look at pi r squared, multiply pi times the radius, and then square that, as opposed to squaring the radius and then multiplying it by pi. You get two completely different answers with those. So yeah, showing your work. And again, that would be a question if you're watching an expert do it. Well, why? How come you started with the thing at the end, the r squared, and then do the pi multiplication? Why didn't you start with pi times r? And then they would have to explain the whole, order of operations and all that stuff. So yeah, so that's good. Showing work, writing out the answer. All right. So, and then we get to the determine the paths. And, honestly, again, this example is pretty simple. So I don't know that there are really multiple paths to completing this particular task. So what we could probably do is really just kind of use this. I don't know that there would be a shorter way to do this or a longer way to do it. There probably would be, but I don't know what it would be for this example. So this probably would be the shortest, easiest path. Show that you know the formula, figure out the radius. I mean, actually, I guess there is another one in here. Figure out radius. Um, I'll just also put here and pi, because that's something they would need to plug in. And then you put those numbers into the formula, and then you do the calculations in the correct order, and then you write out your answer. So I think with this particular task, there's probably not a more complex method. Um, and I don't know that even if there was, there would be a reason that you would need a more complex way to do this. So we've kind of now got our path from watching our expert. So then the final thing would be then to just kind of do your own documentation of this. And we kind of already have it written out up here. We could probably tweak this a little bit. So writing out the path steps in sequential order, remember the formula, and you might put in that the formula is area equals pi times r squared. Um, and then figure out radius. And from that, you would also want to make sure that people can get the radius from the diameter. So they would need to know that the diameter is twice the radius, and so on. And making sure that they know pi. And then, putting numbers in, calculating, and then writing out your answer. Um, so yeah, so I mean, this example in the end almost writes itself. But obviously, a lot of you are dealing with some instructional goals that are less clear cut, and in which case you may find that there are multiple ways to get to a particular outcome, and you'll want to decide ahead of time which of those paths you want your students to use and kind of commit to. So I just wanted to kind of walk through that just as a way to kind of put this in slightly concrete terms in terms of what these look like. In the end, and certainly for this week's work, it's going to be an outline form. So it's going to be a numbered list where each step has a number, and you just kind of quickly describe the outcome of that step. And then there will be some sub items underneath that will have to do with the prerequisites and so on. And we'll get to that in a minute. But I'm not looking for, I mean, if it's easier for you to start out with sort of a narrative version of the task that, or the steps in your goal, you can do that. But for the purposes of what we're going to do, you can just turn it into a numbered list. Doesn't even need to be complete sentences or paragraphs or anything. Just, number one, here's the step. Number two, here's the step. Number three, here's the step. And I do have a bit of an example on the assignment page itself to kind of show what I'm looking for. All right. So again, now that we kind of walked through it, any other comments, questions as you're thinking about your own instructional goals from your ID plan? Can you kind of picture what this would look like for your particular goals in terms of what you would be doing to get these steps in place? All right. Well, I mean, like I said, you will have an opportunity this week. That's basically the main part of the work, is just walking through this with one of your own goals. See how it goes. If you have questions, if you want me to take a look at something along the way. I mean, I'm obviously not a content expert in many content areas, so I can help out to an extent in terms of maybe just what it looks like to me and the formatting and kind of breaking down the steps. But if you can find somebody, if you are not an expert in the topic that you're working on, find somebody that you can bounce the ideas off and say, hey, does this look like, you know, what the steps would have to be in order for a student to do this particular thing. All right, so the other piece of this, which is a smaller piece but is still important, has to do with the prerequisites and pre-training. So once you have your steps, the next thing you want to do is look at each step and ask yourself, are there things that the student needs to know before this step will make sense to them? So as an example, pi. So in this last one, they get to plug in the numbers. So if they get to that step, they can't plug in the number for pi if they don't know what the number for pi is. So a prerequisite for that step would be that somewhere prior to this, you have taught them what the number pi is, so that they know what number to put in. So that would be an example of a prerequisite. A prerequisite for this first step, remember the formula, would be the formula. You know, unless you're planning on teaching them the formula, if this is the first time they've ever done the area of a circle, then your first step may have to be teach them the formula for this. But if you've already gone through a bunch of geometry formulas, then to do this particular thing, the prerequisite would be knowing the formula for the area of a circle. So that would be a piece of information they would need to know. Doing the calculation, prerequisite there that I mentioned before would be the order of operations. I think I've had enough math teachers in these classes that I've kind of learned some things. I think it's PEDMAS, I think is the phrase they use. And I think it's, shoot, can't remember what the P is. Parentheses, then exponents, then division, then multiplication, then addition, then subtraction. I think that's PEDMAS. I think that's what they use. But in any case, if they're going to make the calculation come out with the right number, knowing the order of operations is going to be something they have to know how to do already. Or as I said, a number of students will start by multiplying the pi times the radius and then squaring that instead of radius squared times pi. So all of these, basically you want to look at each step and just ask yourself, what are the things that the student needs to know first? And the reason you want to do that is to double check that if it's not a part of this instructional unit, that it is something that you know that they've had prior to it. Or if it's something that you know they haven't had before, then you're going to need to build that into your steps. That's going to have to become a piece of your steps. So you might find yourself having to go back and add steps in if you realize, oh, we've never really talked about the order of operations. This is the first time they've had to do this. So you might have to insert a whole sub step in that's like, teach them the order of operations or something like that. The question with the prerequisites is always, how far down do you go? So you can get ridiculous with this. So for example, okay, we're doing math. So they need to know how to multiply. That's true. They need to know their numbers, right? They need to know what a decimal point is. They need to know, you can take it all the way back to like whatever they learned in preschool related to math, because all of that is a prerequisite. I mean, yeah, they have to know how to count from 1 to 10. For the point of this, a good threshold or maybe test to do is go down until you can reasonably assume that all students already would know a thing. So if you're in a high school math class, you can reasonably assume that all of your students know how to count to 10. You can reasonably assume that they know how to multiply, using one method or another, right? So those don't necessarily have to be prerequisites because those are more like givens. If they're in this class, this is not even something we should have to even consider. We know that they know this stuff, that they have the ability to do it. So for prerequisites, you really want to just look for those things that may be an issue, where you may have students that don't know a thing that they need to know in order to do this. So, most students probably know pi, but these days, a lot of students also just know that they just push that key on their calculator, but they don't actually know what the number is. Um, you know, uh, the formula. Probably all of us here know pi r squared, but maybe that's something that in this class you may know that some students won't necessarily know. In that case, you want to identify it as a prerequisite because that's what the pre-training is. Because what that means is that before you even start these steps, you're going to want to make sure that you've covered those prerequisites as pre-training. So to go way back to my driving analogy, my car trip analogy, um, if I'm going to be expected to drive to Rochester, then one prerequisite would be that I have a license and I know how to drive a car. And if I don't, then I got to take a couple steps back and learn how to drive a car first, or get my license, renewed before I even start on the trip. Because I'm not going to be able to successfully drive to Rochester if I can't even drive a car. So there's no way I can calculate the area of a circle if I have no idea what pi is, or I have no idea what a radius is, or things like that. A lot of times the terms, once you've come up with your vocabulary, a lot of those might fall under the category of prerequisites. You need to know this terminology before we even get into this topic. So it sounds a little backwards to start with the task and the steps for the task, and then to figure out what they need to know to get into it. But it's actually easier to do it this way because once you know the steps they're going through, it's a lot easier to identify what the things are that they need to have in place before they even go into it. All right, so what this will look like for this week is under each of those numbered bullet points, under each of your steps, there will be, the next level of the outline, so indented in, will be whatever prerequisites are required for that particular step. And again, it's just going to be a list. It's not going to be a narrative. It's not going to be paragraphs. It's just going to be identifying either here's what they need to know or here's what they have to be able to do in order to make this first step successful. And that's how it will get documented. So yeah, let me do this because this is probably the easiest thing to do. Then let me jump over to over to here. I think this is where I put the sample. So this page in Blackboard just kind of goes through the forum assignment. The reason I put it on a separate page, and I may just be missing something in Blackboard, but one of the things I've learned about forums is that when I put in all the instructions for a forum, you as the students don't see those instructions unless you create a thread. For some reason, I would think that when you open the forum, the instructions would be there, but for some reason, Blackboard keeps the instructions hidden until you are actually composing a thread. Because this post is a little more involved and you're probably going to want to have it written before you post it in the forum, I just included the instructions here on a separate page so you can kind of see what you need to prepare and have written, and then you can probably just copy and paste it into the forum. But at the bottom of it, what I'm pointing out is, here's a little bit. I didn't do the entire thing, but here's a little bit of an example of what it will actually look like. So here was the goal, which in this case had to do with interpreting composers' expressive intent through notation in music. So I've got my steps: identify the expressive notation elements, determine which realm they belong to, And in that case, a prerequisite in my school district is what we call the Big Six framework. So they kind of need to know what the Big Six are before they can figure out which element belongs in which of the Big Six. Then they've got to decode the elements. That's a step. And in order to do that, they need to have a knowledge of the terms and symbols. They need to know how they can look up terms that they may not know. So those would be prerequisites to completing that step, and so on and so on. So this is, 3 steps out of what might be 4 or 5 or 6 steps, but just to get a bit of an idea, what your post is going to look like is not going to be any more complicated than this. So it's, again, not a narrative, it's not paragraphs, it's bullet points, kind of in outline form, where you have each of your steps, and then under each step, if there's any prerequisites, you have those. And you've also, you'll also be posting whatever the goal is, so that people who are looking at it can kind of see what you're aiming for, and then look at the steps that you've come up with. So, yeah, and again, this is that idea. This is about the outcomes. So you'll notice that what they need to do in the end is determine which realm each element belongs to. That's the outcome. That's not how I'm going to teach it. There's going to be activities that they do and worksheets that they do and discussions that we have that will get them to where they can do this thing. All I'm interested in here is the outcome. So by the time we get done with step 2, my students will be able to determine, which of the Big Six each of these things belongs in. So that's just an example of what I was saying earlier about focusing on the outcomes. Yeah, and then the rest of this is just the instructions for the forum itself. You will be each creating your own thread. What you might want to do in the topic for your thread is, like, you could put your last name if you want to, or something, just to identify who it is, but maybe just, 1 or 2 or 3 words about what the topic is. Because then as people are looking through the forum posts, if they see a topic that's something they're familiar with, that might lead them to take a look at your post and give you some feedback. So if you're a math teacher and you post something about, it's a math topic, then other math teachers would know to maybe look in on that one and give you some feedback from that perspective. So the steps, if you have multiple goals, you're going to pick one. Then you're going to go through that 4-step process. And that, you don't need to turn in the 4-step process. You can document that on your own however you want. The end result is you want to end up at that numbered list of steps. You will most likely be using yourself as the expert, but feel free to use outside help as well. And again, once you've posted, you'll be getting some feedback from other students too. Once you have that list, figure out your prerequisites. And then for the actual post, you're going to start with your instructional goal, and then your numbered list for the steps to the goal, and then you're going to create those sub items for the prerequisites under any steps that they belong. And then, and like I said, you're probably going to be easier to create that in like Word. And then once you have it all typed up, copy it, paste it into your post here, so that you're not having to compose the post actually in the forum. And then again, once you've posted, take a look at other posts that are there. And if you see ones that are topics you can relate to, then feel free to jump in and give some feedback. If you have any suggestions, any things that you see, if they've missed a step, or, anything along those lines, feel free to provide that feedback. And then you can always reply to replies. If somebody posts to yours and has a good idea, you can always reply back to them and, have a little conversation about it. But that's sort of the point of the forum structure, or the forum method. So that's the main homework for this week. I know many of you are still working on completing phase 1, so I didn't want to pile too much into this week. that should obviously be the first goal, is to get that phase 1 done, because you're going to need those instructional goals in place before you can start obviously coming up with the steps to reach them. But beyond reading the chapter on segmenting and pre-training, which will just support these same ideas, really that is the work for the week. Take a goal, tear it apart, figure out what the roadmap is that's going to help students get to the goal in the end. So the chapters here, reading number 4, the page I was just on, the form assignment details, just so you know what it is the forum post is, and then obviously the forum itself where you'll create your thread and do your post. All right. Any questions, concerns, confusions? Always seems to be C words, comments, criticisms. All right. Well, so like I said, this, we're kind of shifting gears here now. The first 4 weeks were to go back to our analysis of instructional design frameworks from the beginning of the course. The last 4 weeks have been about the analysis piece, to really understand that there's an educational need, what that need is, what the goals are that are going to address that need. Now we're shifting gears and moving into what we would probably consider the planning phase or the design phase, where we are now starting to actually figure out what are the things that we're going to do to get the students to reach those goals. So we'll be looking at this week. Next week, we're going to look at different types of learning, because if you're teaching a concept, or you're teaching now I'm blanking on them. If you're teaching a psychomotor skill, if you're teaching a procedure, each of those is going to have slightly different ways of approaching them. You don't teach procedures the same way that you teach concepts. So we're going to start looking at that, because once you have this framework, you can then look at each step and say, well, this step, what I'm teaching is a concept. And in this step, what I'm teaching is a procedure. And in this step, what I'm teaching is, a motor skill. Excuse me. So that's going to be the topic for next week. So we're going to kind of add an additional layer into this framework. And by the time we get this framework built, you're going to have a pretty clear idea of exactly what these lessons are going to look like, what the goals are going to be, and what kind of materials you're going to be looking for to support instruction. And that's where we're going to start getting into, sort of finally, some educational technology pieces of looking at how to align various types of educational technology with different types of learning and different types of steps and outcomes. So that's kind of just a brief look at where we're headed in the next several weeks. But now we're shifting into that planning mode. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, we are pretty much exactly 1 hour in. That seems good for a Tuesday night. Continue to reach out with questions and concerns. Those of you that have phase 1 turned in, I will be trying to get through those and provide some feedback on those over the course of the week. And if you're still working on phase 1, that's fine. Take the time, do it right, make sure you're really comfortable with it, and just get it turned in when it's good to go. All right. I think that's it for me. So enjoy the rest of your evening. Enjoy the week to come. And as always, I'll hang out here until everyone's left. So if you've got anything you want to ask, feel free to hang out for a couple minutes. But thank you all, and may see you in another week.
Thank you.